The great hall of the Galactic Senate buzzed with conversation as hundreds of alien representatives took their seats. The massive dome above them showed the swirling colors of space, and holographic displays floated in the air showing trade routes, military positions, and diplomatic agreements. This was the center of galactic civilization, where decisions were made that affected trillions of beings across thousands of worlds. Ambassador Kexthon of the hegemony stood at the central podium, his blue skin gleaming under the lights. His forearms moved gracefully as he spoke, and his voice carried clearly through the translation systems that let every species understand each other. Behind him, a holographic display showed Earth's latest request for military assistance. "Honored delegates," Kexthon said, his voice filled with barely hidden amusement. "We gathered today to discuss yet another petition from our human friends. It seems their shipping lanes are being attacked by pirates again, and they want our help to stop them." Laughter rippled through the chamber. The crystalline Vexnari made tinkling sounds that served as their version of chuckling. The hive-minded Thekmor created a low humming noise that showed their collective amusement. Even the energy-based Luminari flickered in patterns that meant they found this funny. Commander Sarah Chen sat in the human delegation section, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She was a career military officer, trained in the best academies Earth had to offer. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dress uniform bore the medals of 20 years of service. But here, in this chamber, she felt like a child asking adults for help with playground bullies. "Let us review Earth's military capabilities," Kexthon continued, calling up another holographic display. "They still use kinetic weapons, bullets and missiles that rely on simple physics rather than advanced energy manipulation. Their ships are powered by fusion reactors instead of matter-antimatter cores. And most amusing of all, they still send soldiers to fight hand-to-hand combat instead of using neural disruptors or consciousness transfer weapons." The laughter grew louder. Ambassador Thelvar of the Sovereignty, a tall creature with 6 legs and skin like polished metal, stood up from his seat. "Honored Kexthon, perhaps we should remind our human friends that this is the year 3387, not 2387. Most civilized species abandoned such primitive methods of warfare centuries ago." More laughter echoed through the chamber. Chen felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger. She had seen what human weapons could do. She had served on ships that could punch holes through asteroids with their railguns. She had fought alongside Marines who could take down enemies twice their size with nothing but training and determination. But here, surrounded by aliens with technology that seemed like magic, those achievements felt small and worthless. "The pirate problem is serious," Chen said, standing up from her seat. Her voice cut through the laughter and the chamber fell silent. "They have destroyed 12 civilian cargo ships in the past month. Hundreds of innocent people have died." "Of course it's serious, dear human," said Ambassador Velnari of the Crystal Collective, her voice making musical notes as she spoke. "But perhaps if Earth adopted more modern defensive systems, these primitive pirates would not be such a threat. We have offered to sell you our phase shield technology many times, at prices we cannot afford," Chen replied firmly. "A single phase shield generator costs more than our entire annual military budget." "Then perhaps," suggested Thelvar with a smile that showed his sharp teeth, "Earth should focus on trade and leave military matters to those better equipped to handle them. After all, there is no shame in admitting one's limitations." The chamber erupted in agreement. Dozens of species voiced their support for this idea. Earth should stick to what it did best: farming, mining, and basic manufacturing. Leave the complicated business of galactic security to the advanced civilizations. Chen looked around the chamber at all the alien faces. Some showed pity, as if they felt sorry for the poor, backward humans. Others showed contempt, as if they thought humanity was too stupid to understand how outclassed they were. But a few, especially among the older delegates, showed something else. Something that looked almost like nervousness. "The vote is clear," Kexthon announced. "Earth's petition for military assistance is denied. We recommend that humanity modernize their approach to conflict resolution and consider peaceful alternatives to violence." As the session ended and the delegates began to file out, Chen heard whispered conversations in dozens of languages. Most were jokes about human stupidity or primitive technology. But then she heard something that made her stop walking. Hard to believe these creatures once made the entire galaxy tremble. Ambassador Thelvar was saying to his aide as they passed near the human section. How far they have fallen. His aide, a younger sovereignty member with bright silver skin, looked confused. Sir, I don't understand. The humans have never been a major galactic power. They only achieved faster than light travel about 300 years ago. Thelvar's expression changed, becoming more guarded. Of course. My mistake. I was thinking of someone else. But Chen had caught the exchange, and she saw the way Thelvar's eyes met hers for just a moment. There was something there. Recognition, maybe even fear. As if he knew something that others had forgotten or chosen not to remember. Chen activated her communication device as she walked toward the exit. Admiral Morrison, she said quietly. The petition has been denied. The voice that answered was crisp and professional. Admiral Victoria Morrison had been commanding Earth's defense fleets for 15 years. She was known for her calm demeanor and strategic thinking, but Chen could hear something cold in her voice now. I see. And their reasoning? The usual. We're too primitive, too violent, too backward. They suggested we focus on peaceful alternatives and leave military matters to our betters. There was a long pause on the other end of the communication. Then Morrison spoke again, and her voice carried a tone that Chen had never heard before. It was the voice of someone who had made a difficult decision. Commander Chen returned to Earth immediately. Tell no one about this conversation. When you arrive, report directly to Strategic Command. Authorization code Omega 77. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. Omega 77 was a code she had never heard used before, but she knew what it meant from her training. It was the authorization for protocols that were so classified that most of the military didn't even know they existed. Admiral, are we really going to… Commander. Morrison's voice cut her off. For 1,000 years, this galaxy has forgotten who we really are. They have convinced themselves that we are weak, primitive, harmless. They have rewritten history to make themselves feel better about their own failures. But history has a way of repeating itself, and some lessons need to be taught more than once. The communication ended, leaving Chen standing alone in the corridor outside the Senate chamber. Around her, alien delegates continued their conversations about trade agreements and diplomatic marriages and a dozen other topics that seemed suddenly unimportant. As she walked toward her transport ship, Chen thought about Thelvar's words. Once made the entire galaxy tremble. What had he meant by that? What history had been forgotten or hidden? And what was Admiral Morrison planning to do about it? The answers, she suspected, would come soon enough. And when they did, the galaxy might remember why it had once been very afraid of the small primitive species from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The battle for Kepler 442b lasted exactly 17 minutes and 34 seconds. In that time, Zektar, the destroyer's fleet of 47 warships, was reduced to burning wreckage scattered across 3 light seconds of space. The human fleet of 23 ships suffered the loss of only 2 vessels, both destroyed in carefully planned ramming attacks that took out targets 3 times their size. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the UTS Indomitable, watching the tactical display as the last of the pirate ships tried to escape. Her vessel had taken heavy damage. The hull was scarred by energy weapon strikes, and one of her railgun turrets was completely destroyed. But the ship was still fighting, still hunting. Captain, her weapons officer reported, we have a lock on the fleeing Krugan battleship. Shall I engage? Vasquez studied the display. The battleship, Zektar's flagship, was running at maximum speed toward the edge of the system. Its shields were down and its weapons were offline. It was no longer a threat. Negative, she said. Let him go. Sometimes it's more useful to have survivors who can tell the story. Her bridge crew looked surprised, but they followed orders. The Krugan flagship escaped into hyperspace, carrying its cargo of fear and defeat back to whatever hole it had crawled out of. All ships. Report, Vasquez ordered, opening a communication channel to the rest of the fleet. The responses came quickly. The human fleet had performed exactly as planned. Every ship knew its role. Every captain understood the mission. They had fought not as individual vessels, but as a single weapon directed by a collective intelligence that wasn't technological. It was purely human intuition and training refined over centuries. Admiral Morrison. Vasquez reported to the fleet commander. The pirate base has been neutralized. Total enemy casualties estimated at 90%. We've secured the system and are preparing for Phase 2. Morrison's voice came back immediately. Excellent work, Captain. Begin rescue operations for any survivors in the area. Then proceed to the hegemony border world of Tal Shin. Intelligence reports suggest refugee camps there need medical assistance. Vasquez smiled grimly. Phase 2 wasn't about fighting. It was about reminding the galaxy what humans were really capable of when they chose cooperation over conquest. The news of the battle spread through galactic communication networks faster than the human fleet could travel. At first, the reports were dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. A tiny human force destroying one of the most feared pirate fleets in the Outer Rim? Impossible. But then the sensor recordings arrived, transmitted by automatic beacons that every ship carried for insurance purposes. The galaxy watched in growing disbelief as human ships moved through space like predators, their weapons tearing through advanced alien technology with contemptuous ease. On the hegemony world of Zentari Prime, military analysts worked around the clock trying to understand what they had seen. The weapons themselves weren't particularly mysterious. Kinetic penetrators accelerated to high velocity, electromagnetic railguns, antimatter warheads. The technology was actually quite simple compared to modern galactic weapons, but the application was revolutionary. Where most species relied on energy shields and long-range combat, the humans had deliberately chosen weapons that made such defenses useless. Kinetic energy couldn't be deflected or absorbed. It could only be stopped by armor thick enough to withstand the impact, and no ship could carry that much armor and still be mobile. It's not the weapons, reported Admiral Kethvar to the Hegemony High Council. It's the tactics. They fight like they expect to take losses. Like individual ships don't matter as long as the mission succeeds. And they coordinate their movements in ways that suggest either shared consciousness or training, beyond anything we've seen before. The Sovereignty had similar concerns. Their military commanders studied the recordings and came to uncomfortable conclusions about human capabilities. These weren't the primitive, clumsy fighters that galactic civilization had grown accustomed to mocking. These were soldiers who understood war in ways that most species had forgotten. But it was when the human fleet arrived at Tal Shin that the galaxy truly began to remember what it had chosen to forget. Governor Yeltani of Tal Shin was a career diplomat. Trained in the finest hegemony academies, she had overseen the evacuation of 3 systems when Zektar's pirates had begun their campaign of terror. And now she was trying to manage refugee camps that housed nearly 2 million beings from a dozen different species. The camps were a nightmare of overcrowding, disease, and despair. The hegemony had provided basic shelter and food, but their medical facilities were overwhelmed and their security forces were stretched thin. Fights broke out daily between different species, and the death rate was climbing steadily. When her sensors detected the approaching human fleet, Yeltani's first thought was panic. Humans were known to be violent and unpredictable. The last thing she needed was a fleet of primitive warriors adding to her problems. But the human ships that entered orbit around Tal Shin weren't warships. They were hospital ships, supply vessels, and construction platforms. Admiral Morrison herself came down to the planet's surface in a simple shuttle, accompanied by a small security detail. "Governor," Morrison said when they met in the Planetary Administration Building, "we understand you have a humanitarian crisis here. We'd like to help." Yeltani was suspicious. "What do you want in return?" Morrison looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Nothing. These people are suffering because of pirates that our own space should have been protecting against. We failed in our duty to keep the trade routes safe, so now we clean up the mess." Within hours, human medical teams were working in the refugee camps. Their equipment looked primitive compared to standard galactic medical technology. They actually used physical tools for surgery instead of sonic manipulation fields. But somehow, their techniques worked better than anything the hegemony had tried. Dr. James Park, the lead human medical officer, explained it to a bewildered hegemony doctor. "Your people have forgotten that medicine isn't just about technology. It's about understanding biology, psychology, and sometimes just simple human or alien nature. We've been treating trauma and battlefield injuries for thousands of years. We know how to save lives when everything goes wrong." The human approach was shocking to the aliens. Instead of sterile treatment facilities, they set up triage centers that looked like organized chaos. Doctors worked side by side with patients' families, explaining procedures in simple language and making sure everyone understood what was happening. They didn't just treat injuries, They treated fear, desperation, and hopelessness. But it was the security situation that really amazed Governor Yeltani. The refugee camps had been plagued by violence between different species, ethnic groups that had been enemies for centuries before becoming refugees together. The hegemony security forces had tried to keep the peace with crowd control weapons and detention facilities, but the violence had only gotten worse. The humans took a different approach. Instead of trying to suppress the fighting, they addressed its causes. Human engineers worked around the clock to improve living conditions in the camps. Human negotiators sat down with the leaders of each group and worked out agreements that gave everyone a stake in maintaining peace. And when violence did break out, human security teams responded with overwhelming force that ended fights quickly and decisively. "How do you do it?" Yeltani asked Morrison during one of their daily briefings. "Your people have turned a disaster zone into something that actually functions." Morrison looked out the window at the camps, where human and alien medical personnel worked side by side, where construction crews were building permanent housing, where children from a dozen species played together under the supervision of human teachers. "Experience," she said simply. "We've done this before. Many times." That night, as Yeltani reviewed the daily reports showing dropping death rates and rising morale throughout the camps, she received an urgent message from Zentari Prime. Intelligence reports suggested that a surviving group of Krugan pirates was planning an attack on Tal Shin, hoping to recapture slaves and supplies from the refugee camps. She immediately contacted Morrison with the warning. The Admiral's response was calm and professional. "Thank you for the information, Governor. We'll handle it." Yeltani expected to see the human hospital ships retreat to a safe distance while their warships took defensive positions around the planet. Instead, she watched as the human fleet simply disappeared. Her sensors couldn't detect them anywhere in the system. 12 hours later, the Krugan attack force arrived. 15 heavy warships led by one of Zektar's surviving lieutenants. They expected to find a lightly defended refugee world ripe for pillaging. Instead, they found ghosts. The human ships appeared out of nowhere, moving like shadows through space. They had been running silent, using passive sensors and heat-dampening systems to become invisible to conventional detection. The Krugan force didn't even know they were under attack until the first ship started exploding. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The human fleet destroyed the Krugan attackers without taking a single loss, then vanished back into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. The planet Kepler 442b spun slowly in the light of its orange star, its surface scarred by mining operations and illegal settlements. This was the kind of world that existed in the gaps between civilized space, too far from major trade routes to be worth protecting, too valuable to be completely ignored. It was the perfect place for someone like Zektar the Destroyer to build his empire of theft and murder. Zektar stood on the command deck of his flagship, a massive vessel he had stolen from a hegemony patrol 3 years ago. He was a Krugan, 8 feet tall with gray skin like stone and tusks that jutted up from his lower jaw. His people were natural warriors, and Zektar had turned that talent toward piracy. His fleet controlled dozens of star systems on the outer rim, and his raiders struck wherever they pleased. "Report," he growled at his bridge crew, which was made up of criminals and outcasts from a dozen different species. The latest raids were successful. "Sir," reported his first officer, a thin Vexnari named Silix whose crystal body flickered nervously. "We captured 4 human cargo vessels in the past week. The crews were sold to the slave markets on Torgal Prime, and the ships are being stripped for parts." Zektar smiled, showing his sharp teeth. "Good. And the Galactic Senate?" "They refused the human petition for military aid, just as expected. The humans are completely on their own." This made Zektar laugh, a sound like grinding stone. "Of course they did. The mighty galactic powers can't be bothered to help a species that still fights with bullets and bombs. It's almost too easy." For months, his fleet had been targeting human shipping with complete freedom. The humans had tried to fight back, of course, but their small patrol ships were no match for stolen hegemony dreadnoughts and sovereignty destroyers. Every battle ended the same way, with human ships burning in space and their crews begging for mercy that never came. "Sir," one of his sensor operators called out, "I'm detecting an approaching fleet. Large formation, at least 20 ships," Zektar frowned. "No one should be able to approach his base without being detected much earlier." His sensor network extended for light years in every direction. Who are they, hegemony? Sovereignty. The sensor operator, a young Thekmor whose connection to the hive mind made him excellent at processing multiple data streams, stared at his displays in confusion. Sir, the sensor readings are strange. The ships appear to be moving very fast, but they're using what looks like primitive fusion drives. That's impossible, Silix said, moving to look at the displays. Fusion drives can't push ships to those velocities. Not unless... His crystal form flickered with realization. Not unless they've been accelerating for a very long time. Before Zektar could ask what that meant, the communication system crackled to life. A human voice speaking clear galactic standard filled the bridge. This is Admiral Victoria Morrison of the Terran Defense Fleet. You have 30 seconds to surrender unconditionally, or we will demonstrate why our ancestors united this galaxy under one banner. The bridge fell silent. Zektar stared at the communication console as if it had grown extra heads. Then he began to laugh again, louder than before. Terran Defense Fleet. What kind of joke is this? He activated his own communications. Human, you are speaking to Zektar the Destroyer, commander of the largest pirate fleet in this sector. I have 47 warships, including stolen vessels from every major galactic power. What do you have? A handful of primitive human ships with kinetic weapons and fusion drives? The human voice answered immediately, and there was something in its tone that made Zektar's laughter die in his throat. We have something better, pirate. We have memory. Zektar looked at his tactical displays. The approaching human fleet was indeed small compared to his, only 23 ships that his computers identified as destroyers and cruisers. But something about them was wrong. They moved too precisely like parts of a single organism. And their energy signatures, sir, his sensor operator said quietly. I'm reading massive electromagnetic signatures from their ships, and those aren't standard missiles they're carrying. The mass readings are enormous. So what? Zektar snarled, but doubt was beginning to creep into his voice. Mass is meaningless in space combat. It's all about energy weapons and shield technology. Sir, Silix whispered, his crystal form now flickering rapidly with fear. What if the old stories are true? What if humans didn't stumble into space travel? What if they were something else entirely? What stories? Zektar demanded. But Silix was staring at his sensor displays and his answer was barely audible. The stories about why this part of the galaxy was empty when we first explored it. The stories about the species that came before us. The stories about why some of the older races won't talk about the early days of galactic civilization. The 30 seconds were up. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came when the human ships opened fire. Zektar expected to see the familiar light beams of energy weapons or the distinctive trails of plasma torpedoes. Instead, he saw something that made no sense. Tiny points of light that moved at incredible speed, too fast for his eyes to follow. The impacts came a split second later. The lead ship in his formation, a sovereignty destroyer he had captured just last month, simply vanished in a ball of fire and twisted metal. Its advanced shields, designed to deflect any known energy weapon, had been punched through as if they weren't there at all. What was that? Zektar roared. Kinetic penetrators, Silix said, his voice filled with disbelief, moving at significant fractions of light speed. But that should be impossible. The energy requirements to accelerate physical projectiles to those velocities. Another volley from the human fleet. 3 more of Zektar's ships died, their hulls torn apart by impacts that released more energy than some stars produced in a day. These weren't primitive kinetic weapons. They were physics lessons delivered at relativistic speeds. Return fire, Zektar ordered. All ships concentrate on the lead human vessel. His fleet responded immediately. Dozens of energy beams lanced out toward the human ships, enough firepower to vaporize a small moon. But when the light faded, the human ships were still there, their hulls glowing with absorbed energy that seemed to be channeled into some kind of redistribution system. One of the human ships broke formation and accelerated directly toward Zektar's flagship. It was smaller than his massive dreadnought, but it moved with a purpose that made his blood run cold. Captain Elena Vasquez of the UTS Indomitable, a new voice announced over the communication channels. All ships remember your history lessons. Our great-great-grandparents conquered this galaxy not in spite of our primitive weapons, but because of them. Show them why physics trumps fancy technology. The human ship opened fire at point-blank range. But these weren't the relativistic penetrators from before. These were what the humans called railgun rounds, accelerated by electromagnetic fields to tremendous velocities. The impacts tore through Zektar's shields and armor like they were made of paper. More human ships were closing in now, and Zektar realized with growing horror that they were using tactics he had never seen before. Instead of standing off and exchanging fire like civilized species, they were actively hunting his ships, working in coordination to isolate and destroy individual targets. "Sir, we're receiving ramming warnings from the human ships," his communication officer reported. "They're actually planning to ram our vessels." "That's suicide," Zektar said, but even as he spoke, he watched one of the human ships deliberately crash into a Krugan heavy cruiser. Both ships were destroyed, but escape pods were already launching from the human vessel while the Krugan ship burned with no survivors. These humans were willing to die to win. More than that, they were smart enough to make their deaths count for something. "Sir," Silik said, his crystal form now pulsing with terror, "I've been analyzing their approach vector. They didn't just happen to be passing by. They've been building velocity for weeks, maybe months, turning their entire fleet into a kinetic weapon. They planned this." Zektar looked at his tactical display and felt something he had not experienced in years. Fear. Half his fleet was gone, destroyed by weapons that should have been obsolete. The remaining ships were scattered and demoralized, their crews sending him messages begging for permission to retreat. But it was the realization that came with Silik's words that truly terrified him. This wasn't a rescue mission or a patrol that had stumbled across his base. This was a carefully planned military operation, executed with precision and ruthlessness that spoke to centuries of experience. "Signal all ships," he said quietly. "Full retreat. Maximum speed." As his fleet began to scatter, Zektar found himself remembering fragments of stories he had heard as a young Krugan. Tales told by the oldest pirates, warnings about certain systems that should never be entered, legends about a species that had once ruled the galaxy with weapons that turned physics itself into a tool of war. He had always thought they were just stories. Now, as he watched human ships hunt down his fleeing vessels with terrifying efficiency, he realized that some stories were just history that people had chosen to forget. The sealed archives of the hegemony were located 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Zentari Prime, protected by security systems that could withstand the explosion of a small star. For 1,000 years, these files had remained untouched, their contents deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. Ambassador Kexthan descended into the depths with his aide and 2 archive specialists, their footsteps echoing in corridors that hadn't seen visitors in centuries. The deeper they went, the older the technology became. The final vault was sealed with mechanisms that predated modern galactic civilization. "Sir," one of the specialists said as she worked on the ancient lock, "these files are classified at Omega 7 level. That's higher than anything in our current system. Are you certain you have the authority to access them?" Kexthan's 4 hands trembled slightly as he entered his personal authorization codes. "After what we've seen in the past few days, I'm not certain about anything anymore. But if we're going to understand what we're dealing with, we need to know the truth." The vault door opened with a grinding sound that spoke of mechanisms unused for generations. Inside, crystalline storage matrices held data that most of the galaxy had agreed to forget. The archive specialists connected their equipment and began transferring files to portable displays. The first document that appeared made Kexthan's blood turn cold. "The Treaty of Terran Withdrawal," he read aloud, "signed in the year 2387 by representatives of the Human Colonial Authority and the Provisional Galactic Government. Article 1. Humanity agrees to cease all military expansion and withdraw to their core systems. Article 2. All member species agree to remove references to the human consolidation wars from public records." His aide stared at the display in confusion. "Sir, this doesn't make sense. Humans didn't achieve faster than light travel until 2100. How could they have been fighting consolidation wars in 2387? Kexthan activated another file, and the answer appeared in horrifying detail. Star maps showed the galaxy as it had existed 1,000 years ago. Not the careful balance of power that existed today, but a vast region of space colored in the blue of human control. "They didn't just achieve faster than light travel," Kexthan whispered. "They perfected it. Look at these expansion dates. Within 50 years of leaving their home system, they controlled a quarter of the galaxy. Within 2 centuries, they dominated everything. More files opened, showing military records that read like descriptions of natural disasters. The hegemony's own ancestors had fought against human expansion fleets and lost every major engagement. The report spoke of human tactics that made no sense by conventional military standards. Ships that would ram enemy vessels after evacuating their crews. Commanders who treated their own lives as expendable resources. Entire fleets that would sacrifice themselves to achieve strategic objectives. The Battle of Rigel Sector, read one report. Human forces numbering only 37 vessels engaged a combined hegemony sovereignty fleet of over 200 ships. Expected outcome, complete human defeat. Actual outcome, total enemy fleet destruction with 89% casualties. Human losses, 29 vessels. Analysis suggests humans view individual ship loss as acceptable cost for mission success. The aide looked sick as she read over Kexthon's shoulder. These reports, they make humans sound like monsters. No, Kexton said quietly, continuing to scroll through battle reports that all ended the same way. Human victory at costs that no other species would accept. They make humans sound like soldiers, real soldiers, not the civilized warriors we've become accustomed to. Another file showed the progression of human diplomatic relations during the consolidation period. It wasn't the story of conquest that Kexton had expected. Instead, it showed a pattern of human forces defeating enemy fleets, then immediately offering generous peace terms to the survivors. Terms of hegemony surrender, he read. Human colonial authority offers full autonomy to hegemony worlds in exchange for cessation of military resistance. Hegemony government, military command structure, and trade relationships to remain intact. Human governance limited to external security and interspecies dispute resolution. Similar treaties existed for every species in the galaxy. The humans hadn't conquered in the traditional sense. They had simply made resistance pointless while making cooperation profitable. Their military superiority was so overwhelming that fighting them was suicide, but their peace terms were so reasonable that surrender was actually attractive. They turned the entire galaxy into a protection arrangement, the aide said in amazement. They provided security and dispute resolution in exchange for what? Kexton found that answer in the economic records. Trade access and a small tribute. Look at these numbers. They were asking for less than most species spent on their own militaries. They were offering a better deal than anyone could provide for themselves, but it was the final set of files that explained why the human empire had ended and why the galaxy had chosen to forget it ever existed. Personal log of Emperor Marcus Chen, Human Colonial Authority, Kexton read. Date, 2386. We have achieved everything we set out to accomplish. The galaxy is at peace, trade is flourishing, and conflicts between species have been reduced to diplomatic disagreements. But the cost has been enormous. Our people have become a warrior caste ruling over civilians. Our children are born into military service. Our culture revolves around conflict, and we have forgotten how to live without war. The log continued with entries that showed a gradual recognition among human leadership that their empire was changing them in ways they didn't like. They had created peace for everyone else, but at the cost of becoming something they no longer wanted to be. We are withdrawing, the final entry read, not because we have been defeated, but because we choose to remember who we were before we became who we needed to be. The galaxy can govern itself now. We have given them the tools and the peace they need to build something better. We will return to our core worlds and try to find our way back to being human instead of just being warriors. The Treaty of Terran Withdrawal hadn't been imposed on humanity by a victorious alliance. It had been proposed by the humans themselves. They had voluntarily given up an empire that spanned half the galaxy because they wanted to save their own souls. And in return, the rest of the galaxy had agreed to pretend it never happened. The peace that humanity had created was too valuable to risk by admitting how it had been achieved. So the history books were rewritten, the records were sealed, and within a few generations, most species genuinely believed that humans were primitive newcomers who had stumbled into space travel. Kexton closed the files and sat in silence for several minutes. Around him, the archive specialist waited nervously for instructions. "Sir," his aide finally said, "what do we do with this information?" Before Kexton could answer, His communication device chirped with an urgent message from the surface. The aide took the call and her expression grew even more frightened. "Sir, there's been another incident. A sovereignty patrol encountered what they thought was a damaged human cargo ship near the Vega system. When they moved to assist, the ship opened fire with weapons that shouldn't exist. The entire patrol was destroyed in seconds." Kexthon felt his heart sink. "How many ships?" 12, sir, including a heavy battle cruiser. A single human cargo ship had destroyed 12 sovereignty warships. Either human technology had advanced far beyond what anyone suspected, or the humans had been hiding their true capabilities for a very long time. "Send a priority message to the Galactic Council," Kexthon ordered. "Emergency session, classification level Omega. We need to discuss the human situation before—" He paused, looking around at the archives that contained 1,000 years of buried truth. "Before they decide they're tired of pretending to be weak." Meanwhile, in the depths of space near the Vega system, Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of what appeared to be a simple human cargo vessel. The ship's exterior was scarred and patched, its hull bearing the marks of a craft that had seen hard service in the outer rim trade routes. But the interior told a different story. Banks of computers processed targeting data with quantum efficiency. Weapon systems that officially didn't exist powered up with the hum of contained antimatter. And in the ship's holds, instead of trade goods, lay the sleeping forms of 200 human marines in powered armor. "Captain," her tactical officer reported, "the Sovereignty Patrol has been neutralized." "No survivors, no escape pods launched?" Chen nodded. She felt no satisfaction in the destruction of the alien ships, but they had made the choice to attack what they thought was a helpless cargo vessel. In the old days, that kind of mistake would have been corrected through diplomatic channels. But these weren't the old days anymore. "Signal Fleet Command," she ordered. "Phase 3 is complete. The galaxy knows we're not as helpless as we've been pretending. Recommend we proceed to Phase 4. Her communication officer looked up from his console. "Captain, we're receiving a message from Admiral Morrison. She wants all ships to return to Earth space immediately." Chen smiled grimly. "Tell the Admiral that the UTS Hidden Blade is ready to come home. It's been a long time since we've been able to stop pretending to be something we're not." The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the Yao, deepest chambers of the Senate, building on Zentari Prime. Representatives from every major species sat in a circle that had not been used for such purposes in over 800 years. The chamber itself was designed for the gravest of galactic crises, wars that threatened entire civilizations, plagues that could wipe out star systems, or the discovery of threats from beyond known space. Today, they were discussing the possibility that the greatest threat to galactic stability had been living quietly among them for 1,000 years. Emperor Valdris of the Sovereignty entered the chamber with a data pad containing his people's most classified intelligence files. His silver skin was pale with stress, and his usual confident bearing had been replaced by something approaching fear. Beside him walked Chancellor Thexani of the Hegemony, her forearms clutching similar files. The other representatives, from the Crystal Collective, the Thekmore Hive, the Luminary Commonwealth, and dozens of smaller civilizations, all carried the same burden. Each species had found their own buried archives, their own hidden truths about the galaxy's real history. "We are here," announced the council moderator, an ancient Vexnari whose crystal body had grown dark with age, "to discuss revelations that challenge everything we thought we knew about galactic history and our place within it." Emperor Valdris was the first to speak. "My people have uncovered records of what we once called the Human Consolidation Wars. According to our archives, between the years 2150 and 2350, human forces systematically conquered or absorbed every major galactic power through a combination of overwhelming military superiority and diplomatic genius." A murmur ran through the chamber. Some representatives looked shocked, others merely confused. "That can't be right," said Ambassador Velnari of the Crystal Collective. "Humans didn't even achieve faster than light travel until around 2100. They're a young species, primitive compared to most of us." Chancellor Thexani activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber. "This is the galaxy as it existed in the year 2350, according to our sealed archives." The display showed vast regions of space colored in human blue, with only small pockets of independent territory remaining. By that date, Humanity controlled approximately 60% of known space and had defensive treaties with most of the rest. The silence that followed was deafening. The records show, Thexani continued, that human military doctrine was unlike anything we had encountered before. They didn't fight to destroy their enemies. They fought to make resistance pointless. Their peace terms were so generous that surrender became preferable to continued warfare. Valdris nodded grimly. Our own military analyses from that period describe human tactics as incomprehensibly efficient. They seemed willing to accept casualties that no civilized species would consider acceptable, but they never fought without purpose. Every battle served a strategic goal. Every loss advanced their overall objectives. Representative Killmoth of the Thekmor Hive spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of his entire species' collective memory. But why don't we remember this? How could such a massive empire simply be forgotten? The answer came from the oldest being in the chamber, Elder Zixara of the Luminari, whose energy form flickered with the accumulated wisdom of nearly 2 millennia. Because they chose to be forgotten, she said, her voice like the whisper of solar wind. I was young when the Treaty of Terran Withdrawal was signed. I remember the negotiations. Every representative turned to stare at her. In all the centuries of galactic politics, none of them had realized that one of their own had actually lived through the events they were discussing. The humans came to us, Zixara continued, not as conquerors demanding tribute, but as leaders who had grown tired of leading. They said their empire had achieved its purpose, galactic peace, but at the cost of their own humanity. They were becoming something they didn't want to be. She paused, her energy form pulsing with memory. They offered to withdraw completely to their core systems, to give up all territorial claims and military bases throughout the galaxy. In exchange, they asked only that we agree to govern ourselves peacefully and to forget what they had been capable of. Why would they want us to forget? Asked Ambassador Velnari. Because, Zixara replied, they understood something that we didn't. True strength isn't about being feared, it's about being trusted. They wanted to be our neighbors, not our rulers. But that would only work if we didn't spend every day terrified of what they might choose to do if we displeased them. Emperor Valdris consulted his datapad. Our records confirm this. The Treaty of Terran Withdrawal contained specific provisions for the modification of historical records. All references to human military capabilities were to be classified or removed entirely. Within 50 years, most of the galaxy genuinely believed that humans were primitive newcomers. And it worked, added Chancellor Thexani. For 1,000 years, we've coexisted peacefully with a species that could have destroyed us all whenever they chose. They traded with us, learned from us, contributed to galactic civilization, all while pretending to be much weaker than they actually were. The implications of this revelation began to sink in around the chamber. Every representative was thinking the same thing. If humans had been pretending to be weak for 1,000 years, what were they really capable of now? The question, said Valdris slowly, is whether they're still pretending. As if summoned by his words, the chamber's communication system activated. The voice that emerged was calm, professional, and utterly terrifying in its politeness. Honored representatives, this is Admiral Victoria Morrison of the Terran Defense Fleet. I understand you're having a discussion about galactic history. We would appreciate the opportunity to contribute to that conversation. The moderator's crystal form flickered rapidly with panic. Admiral Morrison, this is a closed session of the Galactic Council. Humans are not currently members of... We were founding members of the Galactic Council. Morrison interrupted gently. We withdrew our membership as part of the Treaty of Terran Withdrawal, but we never formally renounced our rights. Under Article 7 of the original Galactic Charter, any founding member may request to address the Council during times of galactic crisis. There was no arguing with that logic. Within minutes, Admiral Morrison materialized in the center of the chamber via holographic projection. She appeared to be speaking from the bridge of a starship, and behind her, the representatives could see display screens showing tactical information that made their blood run cold. Thank you for this opportunity, Morrison said, looking around at the assembled aliens. I understand you've been reviewing historical documents that reveal some uncomfortable truths about the relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. Admiral, Emperor Valdris said carefully, We've discovered records indicating that humanity once controlled a significant portion of galactic territory. We're trying to understand the implications of this information." Morrison smiled, and somehow that expression was more frightening than any show of anger would have been. "The implications are simple, Emperor Valdris. For 1,000 years, we've allowed you to believe that we were weak, because it served everyone's interests. You felt secure, we lived in peace, and the galaxy prospered under a system that worked for everyone." She paused, and her expression grew serious. "But that system only worked as long as everyone chose to be civilized. Pirates attacking civilian shipping, refugees dying in camps while their governments debate politics, military forces targeting what they believe to be helpless cargo vessels. These things indicate that some members of the galactic community have forgotten the basic principles of civilized behavior. We've been trying to address these problems through normal, diplomatic channels," protested Chancellor Thexani, "by denying our request for military assistance and suggesting we modernize our primitive approach to conflict resolution," Morrison asked. "By treating civilian casualties as acceptable losses in political games." The silence in the chamber was absolute. "Let me be clear," Morrison continued. "Humanity withdrew from galactic leadership not because we were defeated, but because we chose peace over power. That choice was made possible by the understanding that the galaxy had learned to govern itself responsibly." Her image gestured toward something off-screen, and the displays behind her showed star charts marked with human fleet positions. "Recent events suggest that understanding was premature, so we're faced with a choice. We can return to our old role as galactic peacekeepers, or we can continue to allow the current system to function while making it clear that certain behaviors will no longer be tolerated." "What are you saying?" asked Ambassador Velnari. "I'm saying," Morrison replied, "that Earth's petition for military assistance is hereby withdrawn. We will handle our own security concerns, as we should have been doing all along. But I'm also saying that humanity will not tolerate the victimization of civilian populations, regardless of their species or political affiliation." She looked directly at the camera, and every representative in the chamber felt as if she were speaking directly to them.